The call came on a Tuesday morning, sandwiched between the squeal of an air wrench and the low rumble of a V8 engine that had seen better decades. Daniel Carter, 37 years old, grease already worked into the creases of his knuckles before 9 in the morning, was crouched beneath the chassis of a pickup truck when his phone buzzed against the concrete floor. He almost didn't answer it. The number was local but unrecognized, and he had a transmission fluid leak that wasn't going to fix itself. But some quiet instinct that he couldn't name made him wipe his hands on a shop rag and pick up. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional. The kind of voice that lived in boardrooms and spoke in complete sentences. "Is this Daniel Carter?" it asked. He said yes, half his attention still on the truck. Then the voice said the words that would reroute the entire course of his life. "My employer would like to meet with you. Her name is Victoria Hayes." He didn't recognize the name immediately. He would, soon enough. "And my father," the voice continued, "has been looking for you for over 10 years. Daniel stood up slowly. His back protested. His mind went somewhere quieter than confusion. It went to a place of complete, hollow stillness. The kind that comes when something large is approaching and you can't yet see its shape. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Outside his small garage, a crow landed on the chain-link fence and regarded him with flat black eyes. "I think," Daniel said finally, "there might be some kind of mistake." There was a brief, polished pause on the other end. "There is no mistake, Mr. Carter," the voice replied. "We will send a car." Daniel stood there with the phone in his hand long after the call had ended. And Tony, his one full-time employee, a 22-year-old with extraordinary mechanical instincts and an equally extraordinary coffee intake, leaned out from under the hood of the adjacent car and said, "You okay, boss?" Daniel said yes. He was not entirely sure it was true. The garage where Daniel spent the better part of every weekday was not a remarkable building. It sat on the outer edge of a suburb called Harlow Heights, the kind of town that had one diner, 2 churches, and a hardware store that had been owned by the same family for 40 years. The sign above the bay doors read Carter's Auto in faded blue letters, the paint peeling at the corners in a way Daniel kept meaning to fix and never quite did. He had bought the property 6 years ago, with money borrowed from his mother-in-law, and paid back ahead of schedule. Inside, the air always smelled of motor oil and metal filings, and faintly, of the pine air freshener he kept hanging from a hook near the register, because his son Ethan had given it to him for Father's Day 2 years ago, and told him very seriously that garages were supposed to smell like trees. Daniel had never taken it down. Ethan was 10 years old, gap-toothed and wide-eyed, with his mother's ears and his father's stubbornness. He was also, in Daniel's private and entirely biased estimation, the best person he had ever known. Every morning, before the garage opened, and before the world got loud, they had their ritual. Daniel would make scrambled eggs never overcooked, always with a little shredded cheddar, and Ethan would pour the orange juice, very carefully, because he had spilled it once, and the conversation about wasted food had stayed with him. They would sit at the small kitchen table with the wobbly left leg, and Ethan would talk. He talked about whatever was on his mind, a book he was reading, a classmate who had said something strange, a bird he had seen on the walk home. Daniel listened the way some people listen to music, completely, setting everything else aside. His own coffee would go cold while he sat there with his elbows on the table and his full attention on his son. It was the best part of every day. Without exception, Laura had died 4 years ago. Ovarian cancer, caught late, moved fast. The grief had not diminished so much as it had restructured itself, settling into the architecture of their daily life, like load-bearing walls that you stopped noticing because you stopped having a choice about them. Daniel did not date. He had not even considered it. Not really. There was the garage, and there was Ethan. And together those two things took everything he had, and he gave them everything willingly. His mother-in-law, Margaret, kept leaving articles on the kitchen counter about widowers and the importance of rebuilding social connection. He read them politely and felt no particular urgency. He was fine. They were fine. Ethan was doing well in school, had a best friend named Marcus, played midfield for a recreational soccer league on Saturday mornings, and had recently announced his intention to become either an astronaut or a marine biologist, a decision he was taking very seriously. Daniel told him there was time. Their routines were small and sacred. Ethan packed his own backpack each night and left it by the door. Daniel checked it every morning, not to add or remove anything, just to confirm it was there. A small gesture of verification that was also, in its way, a small gesture of love. On the drive to school, they played a game they had invented together called One Good Thing, where each of them had to name something they were looking forward to that day. Daniel usually said something about the satisfaction of a clean repair. Ethan usually said something about lunch or recess. Some mornings, when the world felt heavier than usual, Daniel would say, "You, buddy, you're my one good thing." And Ethan, who was 10 and therefore frequently embarrassed by his father, would groan and stare out the window and try not to smile. He always smiled anyway. That small daily exchange was the backbone of their life together, a ritual so ordinary and so necessary that neither of them could have imagined the morning without it. It was during the drive home from school drop-off that Daniel turned back toward the garage and saw the car. It was a black sedan, long and quiet and expensive, parked with a kind of deliberate precision in front of his bay doors. Not the kind of car that usually appeared in Harlow Heights. A woman was stepping out of it. She was perhaps 30, maybe a year or two on either side, with dark hair pulled back in a way that suggested she had thought about it and then chosen function over flair. She was wearing a charcoal blazer over a white shirt, no visible jewelry except small gold earrings, and shoes that looked like they cost more than Daniel's monthly mortgage payment. She moved with the particular economy of someone who had learned very young that time was a resource and waste was a character flaw. When Daniel pulled into the lot and stepped out of his truck, she was already looking at him not with impatience, but with the focused attention of someone accustomed to evaluating things quickly and accurately. "Mr. Carter," she said. It was not a question. "That's me," Daniel said, and then felt mildly foolish about it. "My name is Victoria Hayes." She extended her hand. Her handshake was firm, without being performative. "I apologize for arriving unannounced. My assistant called ahead, but I understand you may not have had time to process the details." She looked around the garage with a gaze that was genuinely observant, rather than dismissive, noting the organized shelves, the clean tool rack, the small whiteboard near the register where jobs were listed in neat handwriting. Whatever she found, she kept her reaction measured. She was very good at that. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. She was wearing the kind of calm that people wear when they are accustomed to being the most composed person in any room. But there was something underneath it, a watchfulness, a held breath, like someone waiting for a verdict. "Your father wants to meet me," he said. "Yes, and your father is Richard Hayes." Even in Harlow Heights, that name registered. Richard Hayes was the kind of man whose name appeared in headlines, on buildings, in conversations at dinner tables belonging to people who had never and would never meet him. He had built one of the largest private investment groups on the East Coast, had his photograph taken with 3 different presidents, and was reportedly worth somewhere in the territory of several $billion. He was also, by most public accounts, intensely private and not given to unexplained social calls to mechanics in suburban New Jersey. Daniel crossed his arms slowly. "Why," he said, "would Richard Hayes want to meet me?" Victoria reached into the inside pocket of her blazer and produced a cream-colored envelope, sealed and unmarked, and held it out. Daniel took it. Inside was a single card, engraved rather than printed. On paper, so thick it felt almost architectural. It read, "Mr. Carter, I have been trying to find you for a long time. I would be grateful for the opportunity to speak with you at your earliest convenience." The handwriting of the signature beneath was firm and slightly uneven, the handwriting of someone older, or perhaps of someone whose hands had recently not been entirely steady. It was signed, Richard Hayes. Daniel turned the card over in his hand, as though there might be something on the back, but there was nothing. Just the front, just those 2 sentences, and the weight of a decade behind them. Daniel read it twice. Around him, the ordinary world continued without interruption. A car passed on the road. A dog barked 2 houses down. A plane moved silently across the clear October sky. He looked up at Victoria. "He's been looking for me for over 10 years, he said. More to himself than to her. "Yes," she said again. "For what?" She met his gaze steadily. He said that's something he'd rather tell you himself. There was a second envelope, smaller, tucked behind the first. Daniel opened it and found a round-trip ticket for a private charter, departing the following Saturday from a small regional airfield 20 minutes from Harlow Heights, destination Connecticut. There was also a printed itinerary, formal and precise, with arrival times and the address of the Hayes family estate in Greenwich. Daniel stared at it. His first instinct was practical. He had no one to watch Ethan for a weekend. His second instinct was the stubborn common sense of a man who had spent 15 years diagnosing mechanical problems. Something here does not add up. And before you take anything apart, you should understand why. His third instinct was quieter than either of those. And he didn't examine it closely yet. It felt, distantly, like recognition, like the echo of something he had done once and then laid down and not thought about since. He called Margaret that evening, and she agreed to take Ethan without requiring any explanation, which Daniel appreciated more than he said. He told Ethan that he had a work meeting out of town, which was approximately true. Ethan asked if it was boring, and Daniel said probably, and Ethan nodded with the deep, satisfied sympathy of someone who had never attended a work meeting and hoped to keep it that way. On Saturday morning, Daniel drove to the airfield in his truck, parked between 2 vehicles worth more than his garage, and boarded an aircraft small enough that he could count all 12 seats, and large enough that he had a full cup of coffee and a warm breakfast before they landed. He spent the flight looking out the window at the geometry of fields below, and trying to prepare himself for a conversation he could not begin to anticipate. The estate sat at the end of a long gravel drive lined with oak trees old enough to have been there during a different century. The house itself was the kind of structure that didn't announce itself. It simply was, large and settled and certain, with ivy on the stone and windows that caught the afternoon light and held it warmly. Victoria met him at the entrance. She had traded the blazer for something slightly less formal but no less deliberate, and she led him through a hallway lined with art he didn't recognize, and into a room that was almost entirely books, floor to ceiling on 3 walls, the fourth taken up by a fireplace, and 2 chairs positioned beside it, as though they had been waiting for this specific conversation for a very long time. Richard Hayes was seated in the left chair. He was older than his public photographs, which was expected. The most recent ones were years out of date, but the greater difference was something that photographs had not captured, and presence now made undeniable. He was thinner than he should have been. There was a cane leaning against the armrest. His hair had gone entirely white, and his face had the particular quality of a man who had weathered a great deal and arrived at a kind of hard-won quietness on the other side of it. When Daniel came into the room, Richard Hayes did something that neither of them had anticipated. He stood, slowly, with effort, pushing himself up from the chair with both hands on the armrests. And then he simply looked at Daniel for a long moment, with eyes that were unmistakably bright, with something that was not quite tears but was closely related to them. "I found you," he said. His voice was rougher than Daniel expected, scraped a little at the edges. "I wasn't sure I would, but I found you." Daniel stood very still. The fireplace crackled. Victoria had positioned herself near the door, slightly outside the frame of the moment, present, but not intruding. "Mr. Hayes," Daniel said carefully, "I think you might have the wrong. Do you remember?" Richard said, lowering himself back into the chair with the deliberateness of someone managing pain. "A snowstorm. About 12 years ago, a man on the side of a highway, outside of Trenton, late at night. The room changed." Daniel felt the specific quality of air that accompanies the moment when something forgotten rises back to the surface. He didn't speak. He moved to the other chair and sat down, and the 2 of them looked at each other across the firelight. And the past came back to him, the way things sometimes do not all at once, but in layers, like light through curtains. He had been 25. working as an apprentice at a shop in Trenton that no longer existed, saving money, trying to figure out what shape his life was going to take. It had been a Sunday in February, one of those nights when the temperature drops 20 degrees in an hour, and the weather service issues warnings that people mostly ignore. He had been driving home on Route 1 when his headlights swept across a figure sitting on the guardrail on the shoulder of the road, hunched against the wind. Something about the posture had made him slow down. Not urgency exactly, but something in the set of the man's shoulders. The way he was sitting, head bowed, as though the weight of everything had become too specific to carry standing up. Daniel had pulled over. He had not been a heroic person, or not consciously, so he had simply seen a man in the cold and applied the logic that had governed his household growing up, which was that if something was wrong and you could help, you helped. His mother had taught him that without ceremony, the way she taught him everything useful, by just doing it herself and letting him watch. He had opened the passenger door and said, "You need a ride somewhere?" The man had looked up. He was maybe 60 at the time, well-dressed in a way that was now disheveled, expensive coat, but no hat, good shoes soaked through. He had looked at Daniel with an expression that was difficult to classify. Not grateful, not yet. Something rawer than gratitude. Something that looked more like surprise, the surprise of a man who had stopped expecting the world to offer him anything and had been proven wrong. He had gotten in the car. Daniel drove. The man said almost nothing. He stared through the windshield at the snow moving through the headlights, and Daniel gave him the silence, figuring the man would talk when he was ready or he wouldn't. They stopped at an all-night diner about 8 miles up the road. The kind with fluorescent lighting and laminated menus and coffee that was strong and hot, if not particularly good. Daniel ordered 2 coffees and a plate of eggs and toast and pushed half of it across the table without making a production of it. The man ate, slowly at first. Then, with the focused attention of someone who had not realized how hungry they were until food was in front of them. At some point, he looked up and said, "You didn't have to stop." Daniel had shrugged. It was cold. Afterward, Daniel had driven to a motel, not cheap, but not fancy. A clean and functional kind of place, and paid for 2 nights at the front desk. He had held out the key and said, "There's a grocery store 2 blocks east if you need it." He had gone back to his car, opened the trunk, and taken out his winter jacket, the good one, not the work one, and brought it back inside. He had placed it on the check-in counter and said, "It's warmer than whatever you've got." And then he had gotten back in his car and driven home through the continuing snow, the heater running and the radio quiet. And he had thought about it for approximately the next 10 minutes, and then let it go. He had not asked the man's name. He had not left his own. He had not thought about it again, not in any sustained way. It had been a cold night, and a man needed help, and he had helped. That was the whole of it, as far as Daniel had been concerned. He had been wrong about that. As it turned out, that was only the beginning of the story, though it would be more than a decade before he understood that. Richard Hayes had stopped speaking. The fire had burned down slightly, and the room was quieter than before. Daniel looked at the older man across from him and felt the strange, slightly vertiginous sensation of 2 timelines meeting. "That was you," he said. It was not entirely a question. "That was me," Richard confirmed. Daniel was quiet for a moment. He thought about the man in the diner, the way he had eaten, the specific hollow quality of his eyes before the food came. "You were in a bad way," he said finally, because it seemed important to name it accurately. Richard Hayes looked at the fire. "I was in the worst way of my life," he said. His voice was even, but it cost him something to keep it that way. "I had been betrayed significantly, financially, and personally, by someone I had trusted completely for nearly 20 years. My business was in a crisis I was not certain I could recover from. My marriage was ending. I had driven out there that night with no particular plan except to be somewhere other than where I was. And then I sat down on that guardrail, and I thought he stopped." His jaw moved once. "I thought that I was very, very tired." The room held that sentence carefully. "You stopped," Richard said. "You asked me nothing. You fed me. You gave me somewhere to sleep. You gave me your coat. He paused. And you left. No name, no obligation, no expectation. Just he spread his hands slightly, a gesture of something vast reduced to gesture. Just a human being treating another human being as though he mattered. When I was not entirely certain that I did, Daniel felt the pressure behind his own eyes and decided not to examine it too closely. He looked at his hands, the hands of someone who worked with them for a living, and said quietly, "I'm glad you're still here." Richard Hayes made a sound that was almost a laugh and was entirely something more complicated. "So am I," he said. "Because of you." The conversation continued for another hour. Richard explained what had come after that night, how he had returned to the city, rebuilt the business from a narrower foundation but a better one, repaired certain things and let others go, and carried with him, through all of it, the memory of a young man who had stopped a car on a cold highway and given everything he had to a stranger without asking a single question. He had tried to find Daniel. He had hired investigators. The absence of a name had made it nearly impossible. And the investigators had come back, again and again, with nothing. The trail was too thin. A diner on Route 1, a motel whose register from 12 years ago no longer existed, a faceless young man in a car whose make and color neither Richard nor anyone else had thought to note. It was Victoria, working through a community automotive database while pursuing an unrelated legal matter, who had finally surfaced a Daniel Carter, single proprietor, Harlow Heights, New Jersey, age consistent, background consistent. She had cross-referenced every detail she could find. The timeline matched. The geography matched. The description, recalled imperfectly but distinctly by Richard, matched. Victoria had said, "Let me handle it." And here they were. Daniel sat with it for a while. Then he said, carefully, "I don't need anything, Mr. Hayes. I didn't help you because I wanted something in return." "I know," Richard said. "That's exactly why I've spent 12 years trying to find you." There was money offered. A significant amount, the kind of number that would have eliminated Daniel's mortgage and Ethan's college fund worry in the same breath. Daniel thanked him and declined. He was not performing modesty, he simply did not want it. What had happened on that highway had been clean, in the way that only unconditional things are clean, and he did not want to trade that cleanliness for a transaction. Richard Hayes looked at him for a long moment after the refusal, and something in his expression deepened. He said nothing, but across the room, leaning against the doorframe with her arms folded, and an expression that was very difficult to read, Victoria Hayes was watching Daniel Carter with the specific attention of someone who has just witnessed something they did not expect to see. In a life structured around the management of wealth, she had encountered very few people who turned it down without theater. This man had done it simply, without drama, as though it had never been a real question. She came to the garage 4 days later. She said it was to discuss a potential investment her father had mentioned, in passing, that Carter's Auto might benefit from a capital injection, and as executor of the Hayes Family Foundation's community initiatives, it was within her purview to evaluate such things. It was a technically plausible explanation that convinced neither of them entirely. Daniel offered her coffee from the machine in the back, which was adequate but not exceptional, and she accepted it and drank it without complaint, which he noted. They sat on 2 mismatched stools in the back room with the parts shelves and the smell of oil. And they talked, first about the garage and then about other things, and Daniel noticed that she asked questions in the way of someone who was genuinely curious, rather than someone performing interest. He found that he liked it. What Victoria saw over the course of that visit, and the 2 that followed over the next 3 weeks, each with a slightly more transparent pretext than the last, was a man who ran a small business with an integrity that was entirely unself-conscious. She watched him spend 45 minutes diagnosing a problem for an elderly customer, and then tell her she didn't need the repair she'd come in expecting, saving the woman several $100s. She watched him waive off payment from a man who came in flustered and short on cash with a flat tire that needed changing. She watched the way his posture changed when his phone screen showed a call from Ethan's school, not with anxiety, but with a kind of immediate, complete reorientation, as if everything else in the room became background until he knew his son was fine. She watched him train Tony with patience and genuine investment, the way someone teaches who actually cares whether the other person learns. She had grown up in a world where worth was measured in leverage and acquisition, and the strategic management of perception. She had been raised to be excellent. And she was but excellence. In the environments she had inhabited, had always been oriented outward, toward outcomes, toward demonstrable results. What she observed in Daniel Carter was something different. His goodness was not a strategy. It was not a brand. It was simply what he was, expressed quietly in the ordinary decisions of an ordinary day. Like water finding its level, she found it disorienting in the best possible way. For his part, Daniel saw a woman who was very good at being alone in company, who knew how to be in a room without being in it, in the way of someone who had learned early that visibility carried risk. She was sharp and funny when she let herself be, which was not often, and she had a habit when she was listening closely of tilting her head just slightly to the right, as though receiving information on a frequency that required adjustment. He thought about what it must be like to have grown up as Richard Hayes's daughter, to have inherited all that weight and expectation, to have spent a lifetime being Richard Hayes's heir more than she was simply herself. He thought that she probably hadn't had many people in her life who saw past the Hayes name to the person carrying it. He thought he might be starting to be one of them, and he thought carefully, not pushing on it, that this was the kind of thing worth paying attention to. The moment the axis shifted was a Wednesday afternoon in November, when Ethan was dropped off early from school and arrived at the garage to find a woman he had never seen before sitting in his father's back room, and regarded her with the frank assessment of a child who has not yet learned to manage first impressions. "Are you the lady from the rich family?" he asked. Victoria blinked. Daniel covered his face briefly with one hand. "Ethan," he said. Ethan was not deterred. "Dad said a lady from a rich family came to see about the business. Are you her?" "I am," Victoria said, with a gravity perfectly calibrated to the moment. Ethan considered her. "Do you know a lot about cars?" "Almost nothing," she admitted. He seemed to find this acceptable. "I know quite a lot," he said, pulling up a stool with the confidence of someone who has never been made to feel that his presence required justification. "My dad's been teaching me." He proceeded to demonstrate this by naming every tool on the nearest pegboard correctly and in order, which took approximately 4 minutes and held Victoria's complete, genuine attention throughout. That evening, Ethan showed Victoria how to identify a timing belt by sight, and Victoria helped Ethan with a math worksheet he had been avoiding for 3 days. And Daniel made sandwiches and observed the two of them from the kitchen doorway and felt something shift in his chest that he recognized, distantly, as the specific ache of beginning to want something you had told yourself you weren't going to want. It was not a comfortable feeling. It was also not a feeling he had any desire to make stop. November became December. Ethan's soccer season ended, and he began telling anyone who would listen that Victoria had attended his last game and that she had brought a thermos of hot chocolate and had cheered louder than most of the parents. Victoria began leaving the office earlier on days when she had reason to be in Harlow Heights. Daniel began keeping better coffee in the back room, which he told himself was just good hospitality. Margaret, who was 72 and had not survived as long as she had by being oblivious, mentioned casually during a Sunday phone call that Daniel sounded different lately. He said he didn't know what she meant. She said she knew that he knew exactly what she meant, and they left it at that. Then, January came, and with it, the complication. The board of directors of the Hayes Group, 9 individuals, mostly men, mostly older, collectively representing a great deal of money and a proportionally significant investment in the way things had always been done, became aware of the frequency with which Victoria was visiting a garage in Harlow Heights and the identity of its owner. They called a meeting. The language used in that meeting was careful and corporate and entirely translucent. Concerns about appearances, about the perception of the company's leadership, about the importance of maintaining certain standards of association given the public profile of the Hayes family name. One board member, a man named Gerald Watts, who had been with the company for 30 years, was more direct. He said that Daniel Carter was a mechanic, with no education beyond a 2-year technical certificate, no assets to speak of, no social standing, and no particular reason to be in the orbit of someone in Victoria's position. He said this was a distraction the company could not afford. He said it as though it were simply the truth, delivered as a matter of logic rather than judgment. This was somehow worse than if it had been delivered with cruelty. The press, which had noticed what the board had noticed but arrived at its coverage from a different angle, was less restrained. The word unlikely appeared in several headlines. Photographs were published: Daniel leaving the garage, Victoria arriving, and the captions used the language of contrast: the billionaire's daughter and the small-town mechanic. The implication was not always unfriendly, but it was always reductive. It made Daniel into a story, rather than a person, which was something he had never asked for, and found quietly corrosive. He called Victoria on a Thursday evening and told her he thought they should take some time apart. He kept his voice neutral and said all the sensible things: that the attention was bad for the company, that he didn't want to be a problem for her, that things were getting complicated in ways that weren't fair to her. He said it all very calmly and clearly. The way he approached every mechanical problem: identify the issue, articulate it precisely, implement the correct response. She was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line. Then she said, "Is that what you actually want? Or is it what you've decided is the responsible thing?" He didn't answer right away. That was answer enough. "I'll call you back," she said, and hung up. What happened next was not something Daniel had anticipated. Richard Hayes, who was 71 years old and managing a heart condition and had no particular obligation to attend any board meeting of any kind, called a special session of the Hayes Group Board of Directors for the following Monday morning and attended it in person. He arrived with a cane and a prepared statement, and the absolute authority of a man who had built the thing they were all sitting inside of. Victoria was there. Gerald Watts was there. 8 other board members were there, arranged in a semicircle of expensive suits and carefully neutral expressions. And Richard Hayes, who had spent 12 years looking for a man who had given him his coat in a snowstorm without asking anything in return, told them the story. He told it completely. He did not spare the details of that February night. How low he had been. How close to a kind of ending. How Daniel Carter had stopped his car on a dark highway and done the simplest and most human thing imaginable, and how that simple human thing had, against every probability, saved the course of a life. He spoke about what unconditional kindness looks like when you encounter it stripped of any material incentive. He said that he had spent his career evaluating people and that he had, in his experience, never found a more reliable indicator of character than what a person chooses to do when no one is watching and nothing is owed. He said that Daniel Carter had done that, had been doing it for his entire life with his customers, with his son, with strangers who needed their tires changed and couldn't cover the cost. He said that if the board could not recognize the value of that kind of character in a human being, then they were measuring with the wrong instruments. And he said it in the quiet, certain way of someone who has already decided what is true and is simply informing the room. Gerald Watts started to say something about reputation management. Richard Hayes looked at him over the reading glasses he had put on for his prepared remarks and said, quietly and with great finality, that Gerald could save it. The room was very still. The story broke differently the second time. The full account, Richard's account, told in his own words, through a carefully controlled release to one journalist Victoria trusted, landed in the public conversation with the weight of something true, which is a different weight than most things. The comments and responses that followed were not unanimous, but they were largely the kind that come from people who have been reminded, unexpectedly, of something they believe in. That kindness is real, that it travels, that it finds its way back, sometimes by the strangest and most indirect routes, to where it originated. Daniel read the coverage at his kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, with cold coffee and Ethan's cereal bowl still on the counter, and felt something between embarrassment and a complicated gratitude that he could not fully name. He did not want to be a symbol. He had not done anything that night 12 years ago in order to become one. He had done it because it was cold, and a man needed help, and that was the whole of it, still, underneath everything that had been laid on top. But then Ethan came downstairs in his soccer cleats, the wrong footwear for a Tuesday. But Ethan had a way of committing to choices and sat down across from him and said, "Dad, is it true you're famous now?" And Daniel said no. "Absolutely not." And Ethan said, "Marcus's mom says you are." And Daniel said Marcus's mom was very kind but also somewhat misinformed, and Ethan regarded him with that particular expression he had inherited from his mother, the one that meant, "I see you, and I also see through you, and I love you anyway." Victoria came to the garage that Friday. Not in the black sedan she drove herself. In a dark green car that was still expensive, but did not announce itself quite so loudly. She came in the late afternoon when the light through the bay doors was long and golden, and Ethan was sitting on an overturned bucket in the corner, pretending to read a comic but mostly watching. Daniel was leaning against his workbench, with his arms crossed, which was not the most emotionally open posture he could have chosen. But some habits run deep. "You were going to let the sensible thing win," she said. He considered this. "I was trying to make it easier for you. You were trying to make it easier for yourself," she said, and there was nothing unkind in the way she said it. Deciding it was too complicated is less frightening than deciding it isn't. From the corner, Ethan's comic lowered by approximately 2 inches. Daniel looked at the woman across from him and thought about the night 4 years ago, when he had sat in a hospital parking garage for 3 hours after Laura died, and told himself that you could survive any amount of loss if you just made the right decisions going forward, if you were careful enough, if you kept the important things safe, by not adding anything new to the equation. He had believed that. He had lived by it. He had been, by most measures, successful at it, and here was the evidence that it was also, in some important respect, wrong. Because safety was not the same as living, and keeping things unchanged was not the same as keeping them well. He uncrossed his arms. "I can't promise you an easy life," he said. "I can't promise things won't be complicated, or that people won't have opinions, or that this whole situation doesn't have more moving parts than most people would sign up for." He paused. "But I can promise that I'll always be honest with you, and I can promise I'll always show up. And I can promise," he glanced at Ethan, who was no longer pretending to read anything at all, "that the people in my life are worth knowing." Ethan, from his bucket, said, "That's me. I'm the people." Victoria laughed. It was a full laugh, unguarded and genuine, and it changed the shape of her face completely. Daniel thought he had never seen anyone look more like themselves than she did in that moment. He thought, not for the first time, that this was exactly the problem she had somehow become entirely herself when she was here, in this oil-smelling, impractical, not especially glamorous space, and he had been the unwitting cause of that, and some obligations, once you understood them, turned out not to feel like obligations at all. She stayed for dinner. Ethan made the case, at length, for ordering pizza, and his arguments were both numerous and well-reasoned, and they ordered pizza. They sat at the kitchen table with the wobbly left leg and ate and talked. And Richard Hayes texted Victoria at 8 in the evening to ask how things had gone, and she texted back a single word, "Good," and he sat in his study in Greenwich with his cane leaning against the chair and his cup of decaf and the fire going, and felt something that he had not felt in a very long time, recognized, eventually, as peace, not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of something that made difficulty bearable. He had been looking for it, in one form or another, for most of his life. The months that followed were not without difficulty. Transition never is. Victoria's schedule and Daniel's schedule required a kind of ongoing negotiation that neither of them had practice at. There were days when the distance between their two worlds felt less like geography and more like gravity. There were conversations that went badly before they went well. The board remained cautious, though outwardly compliant. Gerald Watts retired in March, which simplified things considerably. The press moved on to other stories, as press does. And what remained in the public awareness was a cleaner version of what had actually happened. A good man had done a good thing. And the world had noticed, eventually, which it does not always do but occasionally manages. Ethan adapted with the uncomplicated practicality of a 10-year-old who had decided he liked someone and saw no reason to complicate the situation with ambivalence. He began calling Victoria by her first name without being asked. He taught her the rules of soccer with a thoroughness that exceeded her request. He informed her, one Saturday morning while she was helping him with a science project at the kitchen table, that she made his dad seem less serious, which he intended as the highest possible compliment. She told him it was one of the nicest things anyone had ever said to her. He accepted this information without surprise, because he had always had a clear sense of his own quality. He also, in a separate conversation that Daniel was not present for, asked Victoria very directly whether she was going to stay or whether she was going to leave, because he had a policy, he explained, of preferring to know things. Victoria had looked at him for a long moment and then said, very directly back, she was going to stay. Ethan had nodded, satisfied, and returned to his project, and neither of them mentioned the conversation again, though both of them remembered it. Richard Hayes came to Harlow Heights once, in April, when the dogwoods were blooming along the road beside the garage. He came quietly, without announcement, and Daniel walked out to meet him in the parking lot, and they shook hands and stood there in the spring light for a moment without saying anything, which was fine. Some things had already been said. They went inside and had coffee, the good coffee, which Daniel had made a permanent upgrade, and Ethan showed Richard his science project and explained it in thorough detail, and Richard listened with genuine attention and asked 2 questions that made Ethan's face light up with the particular joy of someone who has been taken seriously. The visit lasted 2 hours. When Richard left, walking back to his car with his cane and Victoria on his arm, he paused and looked at the garage, the faded sign, the oil-stained concrete, the ordinary beauty of a small place that held large things, and said quietly, to no one in particular, "Good." It was the whole of what he meant to say. And it was enough. By summer, the sign had changed. The renovation had been small and sensible, expanded bay capacity. New equipment, 2 additional mechanics hired, the parking lot repaved, and above the new bay doors the lettering now read, Carter's Automotive Center, clean and blue, and more durable than before. Ethan had helped choose the color. He took this responsibility very seriously. He had presented Daniel with 3 options on a piece of notebook paper with the various pros and cons listed beneath each one. And Daniel had let him make the final call, and the result was a particular shade of navy that caught the morning light in a way that was, genuinely, excellent. On the morning the new sign went up, Ethan stood in the parking lot with his hands on his hips in the posture of someone conducting a comprehensive inspection, and declared it excellent, which everyone agreed was the right verdict. That evening, after everything had settled and the light was going golden and long across the pavement, Ethan stood beside Daniel and looked up at the sign with the satisfied expression of someone surveying something they have contributed to. Around them, the end of summer evening settled gently, the particular quality of light in late August, warm and slightly melancholy. The kind that makes you aware of the day finishing. Somewhere down the block, someone was grilling, and the smell drifted across on a light breeze, along with the sounds of a neighbor's radio, and from somewhere deeper in the neighborhood, the delighted shrieking of children with a garden hose, the ordinary beauty of an ordinary evening in a place where people lived their real lives. "Dad," Ethan said, "what changed everything? Like, what was the one thing?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. He looked at the sign, then at the open bay doors, then at Victoria, who was leaning against the doorframe with her coffee and her slightly crooked smile and her complete, unhurried presence. He thought about a highway in February, 12 years ago. He thought about cold air and a man on a guardrail and a car door opening into the dark. He thought about eggs at a diner table and a motel key and a winter coat left on a counter and the drive home through the snow with the radio quiet, and the thought, held briefly and then released. That was the right thing, and it is done. He thought about how he had carried that night so lightly. It had barely registered as a memory. While somewhere else, for someone else, it had become the pivot point of an entire life. "One good thing," he said, done without expecting anything back. Ethan looked at him, gauging this answer for completeness. Then he nodded, with the considered seriousness he brought to things that mattered. He reached out and took his father's hand, not self-consciously, just comfortably, the way you hold on to what you know, and they stood there together in the evening light, in front of the garage that was his father's and his grandmother's, and the place where a story had started that none of them would have predicted and all of them had needed. Victoria set down her coffee and came to stand beside them, and the three of them looked at the sign in the last of the August light. And for a moment, nothing needed to be said or done or resolved. They were simply there, together, in the good and ordinary evening. The cricket started up somewhere in the weeds along the fence. Victoria's coffee was probably cold by now, and she was not moving to do anything about it. The dogwoods had finished blooming, but the evening was warm, and the lot smelled of summer and cut grass, and, faintly, from inside the garage, pine. Ethan said, "Can we get ice cream?" Daniel said yes. There are moments in a life that you cannot engineer, that do not follow from planning or ambition or the careful management of outcomes. They arrive from something older and less complicated, from the accumulated effect of small, honest choices, made quietly, when no one was keeping score and nothing was guaranteed. A stranger stops a car, a door opens, a coat changes hands, and somewhere down the road of years, in ways that could not have been anticipated and cannot entirely be explained, something good finds its way back to the place where it started. It does not always happen. The world does not guarantee it, but it happens more often than the cynical version of the story would admit. And when it does, it is worth paying attention to, not because the world is fair, or because kindness is always rewarded, or because stories are required to resolve themselves neatly and completely, but because human beings are connected by threads too thin and too strong to see. And sometimes, if you are lucky, and if you have been honest, not perfect, not exceptional, just honest in the small daily choices that add up to a life, you feel the pull of one of those threads, and you follow it to where it leads. And what you find there, more often than not, is something worth keeping.